Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. We've spent a lot of time here talking about how AI might influence the way we gather and distribute news. But are we paying enough attention to what kind of questions journalists should be asking about AI in the wider world? We sampled 15 journalists from 14 countries to ask, thinking about both your reporting and everyday life, how much attention do you pay to artificial intelligence and the future of work? 21% said they pay a lot of attention, actively following developments in AI and its impact on the future of work. 79% said they pay moderate attention, 0% paid slight or no attention. We also asked to what extent they believe the creators of generative AI products should be held accountable for decisions and actions taken in the real world based on information they provide. 40% said fully accountable, creators should be held responsible for all repercussions of information generated. 40% said partially accountable, 20% said minimally accountable, the user bears some responsibility. Today we're joined by Hilke Schellmann, an Emmy-award winning journalism professor at NYU and an investigative freelance reporter whose new book, The Algorithm, uses information from whistleblowers, internal documents and real-world testing to reveal how AI decides who gets hired, monitored, promoted and fired. We'll ask what lessons we can take from her methodology to report on other emerging AI stories. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars and to a session that I've been looking forward to since Christmas when I read the blurb about Hilke's book in the FT 2024 Books to Read roundup and immediately emailed her and said, please come speak to us.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm blushing. This is like a very kind introduction. And maybe I should say that in Britain, in the UK, the book has a slightly different title. It's actually called The Algorithm: How AI Can Hijack Your Career and Steal Your Future. It's a different publisher. They wanted a different title or slightly different title, but just wanted to tell folks if they're confused. It is 99.9% the same book.
Just a slightly sexy UK spin there.
Yes. They convinced me that they know the market. So
yeah, fair, I guess. Hilke, tell me, I think usually with sessions like this where we're talking about something that might be complicated, it's a good idea to start by defining some vocab. So can we start off just a kind of quick fire round of me asking you, what is AI? For the purposes of this discussion.
Yeah. I think AI is often a marketing term or sort of like a large umbrella term, right? We see it thrown around quite a bit. So in the hiring world, what we mostly see is that there's some quote unquote fake AI where, when I talk to some of the vendors, it turns out that, they use very basic computer science supervised tools, but actually most of the AI that we've seen is machine learning, which is kind of a subset of AI where you give AI training data and it sort of trains itself, and sometimes in an unsupervised, sometimes in a semi-supervised manner. And then you feed it new information, usually from job candidates coming in. And, it sort of comes up with results, usually how close you are to the folks who are in the training data.
Got it. What's generative AI?
So generative AI for me is AI that generates texts. Usually, I think that's the context we mostly see it, where we give it a prompt, kind of like a chatbot, and it generates results. And I think what we see there is, we've seen hallucinations, problems with facts. I tried it last year to generate a resume. It actually wasn't quite long, but it actually generated some kind of books. And I know some of the authors. There's an investigative reporting syllabus that I asked it to write, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that Mark wrote that book, and come to Google it, and I was like, oh, he didn't write that book. There's a hallucination. So I think that for me is generative AI, where we use a large language model that sort of predicts which word is the next, and is really good at it to generate large chunks of text, even full stories.
What is an algorithm?
So an algorithm is like sort of a basic recipe in a way that you have a script. This is what the algorithm does. And I think, we've seen very, for lack of a better word, elaborate algorithms that train themselves that are based on machine learning. But I think we also see we've seen very basic algorithms. And, we've seen it even pre-AI. So we've seen, we had in the US, in New York and in Houston and other places, we had algorithms that were scoring teachers, for example, how well teachers perform in their job. And, they were all kind of abolished and thrown out of points because it turned out that they were actually very basic and they kind of didn't work. And a lot of teachers were wrongly inferred their performance, and that was pre-AI. So an algorithm is just like a set of task or that we give it.
Well, that's a good segue already built into your answer, because what is a ranking algorithm?
Yes. So we see this a lot in AI and hiring and at work, right? Like companies don't just want to use an algorithm to have folks scored, they also want them ranked, right? Like I want to know if I use an algorithm in hiring, like who's the most qualified candidate. So we see a lot of ranking algorithms where an algorithm takes the information and sort of comes up with the score, and it looks like very mathematically appealing, right? Because you get a ranking of all the people that maybe you've asked to do a one-way video interview. They have like very precise scores, like 87.15%, and it looks very mathematically correct. And so we see people ranked, and then the assumption is that, and I think that is actually true in a lot of cases, is that if you as an HR manager get like 3,000 or so applications, and you have a ranking algorithm, you would probably call the first 50 people who have been ranked by the algorithm, not the last 50. That's what we see a lot.
And the numbers don't lie, except maybe they do.
Exactly. So I think that's some of the problems that we see here is that like it looks mathematically correct, and it's actually really hard. Even when I did some of the tests and I got scored, and I knew that there maybe isn't a whole lot of science underneath it, but when you see that scoring, it's just so.
Yes,
I'm so sorry.
Bring it in.
I'm gonna come back in a second. So sorry, now I'm confused by my toddler.
No, that's absolutely fine. We were just saying that sometimes when you look into the in-depth of how the maths that is informed.
So it's mathematical. It just looks so real, and it's just really hard to ignore the math. Of it, and the numbers just look so perfect. And I think that's one of the things that I try to point out is that like the numbers and having an AI screen just feels objectively right. And I think it's really hard to move away from that layer of like computers being objective. We just assume that, and it's really hard to turn away from that. Well, you ask your next question, I'm gonna get some food for the toddler.
Absolutely. And it's worth saying that kids on laps are welcome at the global journalism seminars. So feel free to bring a toddler along. Thank you so much to the many people who are already putting questions in the Q&A function. We will come to those around the 50% mark of the seminar. But I wanted to just kind of emphasize that we really want to focus this discussion on the methodology that Hilke has developed for approaching these stories, because I think that's where we can learn the most. Hilke, there's a review on the dust jacket of your book that says it's not just about the incredible benefits or the doomsday scenarios, and that's from the former VP of Workplace Intelligence at Microsoft. What's the significance to you of striking that balance when you're reporting on AI?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there obviously, as we all know, there's a lot of hype in the space, right? And like journalists sometimes fall into that trap too, right? Like, I mean, and also hype maybe sometimes feels like, oh, hype is good for people to check out my articles, check out my book, right? But I think what I'm trying to really get away from is, and I get this asked all the time, like, do I think that technology is going to solve all our problems, or am I sort of a doomsday scenario kind of person? And I'm neither. Like, what I want to do is like really look into like, okay, what is already happening? Like, we see AI tools being used in hiring, and I think we, the larger public may not be fully aware how much AI has infiltrated hiring and us getting monitored and surveyed our work. And now we see also some signals that signals are being used, AI tool signals being used to fire people. So it's having a huge impact, and we haven't seen a lot of that. So that's like my job, to sort of like look at these AI tools and check them out in different ways, and sort of figure out like how well do they work, and do they not discriminate? Because I think that's, if we want to use algorithms to hire people, like we need to make sure that they don't discriminate and that they actually work, and not just like look at random variables, right? Like, it may, sometimes joke about it, but if we have an algorithm that looks at our facial expressions, or looks at our visuals, it might find that people with brown hair are very successful at a job because most people have brown hair, right? That's just a statistical pattern. And I've uncovered a lot of kind of brown hair problems in the industry where AI tools may have scored people based on things that actually shouldn't be relevant for a job or a hiring decision.
Right. What's the finding from your book that most made the hair on the back of your neck stand up?
Yeah. So I think two things that I think I was really surprised by, and one was pretty early on, where I looked at a company, one of the largest companies that does one-way video interviews, where there's no one on the other side. When you interview for a job, you get like pre-recorded questions on your phone or on your desktop, and you sit there looking into the little green light and answer. And some companies use AI to analyze that, and this is a few years back. And what they used at the time was emotion recognition of our facial expressions, the intonation of our voices, and the words that we use. And I was like, wow, facial expressions to predict how successful we are at a job. Like, I've never heard this. This must be like really new science, and like, pretty incredible, because wow, looks very mathematical and objective. And come to find out, when I started looking deeper and talk to experts and scientists, there really isn't any science underneath it, right? Like, we don't have any science to say, we need to have certain facial expressions to be successful in the job. We really don't have any science that says we need to have certain facial expressions in job interviews that will predict how good we are at the job. So what mostly happens is like the AI was trained with people who have done the video interview maybe a year or so before, and whatever facial expressions they had for certain answers, that was how people were compared to. And I think if you imagine that maybe you don't have a very diverse workforce, that you pick up facial expressions from specific folks, the way how they look like, that has nothing to do with the job, which we really shouldn't be doing. You might not get a lot of diversity, and also like, it's just not valid. There isn't really any science. Like, we're sort of checking something, and computers are really good to check, am I smiling? But they're really not good. Effective computing will infer that I'd be happy if I smile, but we all know that, we're not always happy when we're smiling. We might be really nervous. And also, psychology has shown us that this idea that there are underlying 6 or 7 universal emotions like anger, disgust, happiness is actually not very true anymore. There is a variety of things, so we really shouldn't be using that. So I was quite baffled, because I assume if somebody puts such a powerful tool on the market, that there is science underneath it. But come to find out, there isn't a whole lot of science underneath it. It's just a way we can track those signals. So somebody found a use case for it. And I think the other thing that is a little bit more recent, that I think there's more work to be done, is I found a company that personalizes benefits. And that sounds very benign at the beginning, but the way they sort of talked to me about it was like, there's Aiden, and the AI found out that Aiden woman dropped their spouse from their health plan, which happens in the US a lot because we get health insurance through our employers often.
Right.
So the tool inferred that he's going through a divorce, and the AI tool was going to suggest that maybe he see a therapist. And they also found out that he took a loan against his retirement account. So maybe he needs a financial advisor, right? And they were talking about, give me another synthetic made-up example of someone who had back surgery. They found out that, I don't know, whatever her name is, Maya, had back surgery, and they were going to suggest a physical therapist to her. And I was like, that sounds very creepy. This is like very intimate data that we have to share with our employers if we want health insurance, which, is something that a lot of people in the United States need through their employers. And I'm not so sure that I feel this is, for a lot of people, this is really creepy, right? That your company gives that data away to a third party. And that company also shared with me that they have, health data on millions of Americans. They have specific health claim data on the people that they're covering. So they would know, oh, Hilke had back surgery. I mean, they say that HR would not know it's Hilke, but the tool knows, and would suggest a specific physical therapy or something like that for me. So I think it looks very helpful maybe to some employees, but I think they may not know where these inferences and predictive AI is coming from, and that is based on their personalized data, which apparently gets sold in some sort of marketplace.
That's creepy. That is creepy.
Yeah, it was interesting in one of the private webinars. I did a lot of private webinars where you have to sign up for, and one of the company employees actually acknowledged that, and she said in the webinar, she's like, sometimes it seems creepy, but I try to talk them out of that. And I was like, wow, if you think your own job is creepy, that maybe should tell you something.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the private webinars, tell us a little bit about the journalistic tools that you use to gather this information.
Yeah. So, my background is being an investigative journalist, right? So I've been trained in in investigative methods. So I try to use some of them. So I, try to find insiders willing to speak, right? So folks who are, I think a lot of sources for me were employment lawyers and folks who are like employment lawyer adjacent, as I call. So there's one person who's actually an industrial organizational psychologist, but he gets called in a lot when vendors may be selected by a big company who want to use their tools, and maybe they do some due diligence, just testing it out, and maybe they bring in outside counsel, right, or like an industrial organization psychologist to look at these things, these tools, and vet them. And I think I was surprised when I talked to one, John Scott. He's the industrial organization psychologist, who looked at 5 resume screeners and said that he found biased variables in all 5 of them, meaning that the tool sort of learned, maybe what makes a person successful in a pile of resumes of the people who currently work at the job or have been hired into the job the last few years. And he said he found biased variables like the name Thomas. So if your name was Thomas, you got more points. If you had the words Canada and Syria on your resume, you got more points. Which, for an employment lawyer in the US, that could be a discrimination based on national origin, which is not allowed in the United States. And he found other variables like basketball, football, that were inferred as successful, so people get more points or had that on their resumes. So probably where that comes from is this is, AI tools are statistical pattern seekers, for lack of a better word. So they look for statistically relevant words on resumes, right? And if you have a resume, you only have words on them. So there's no at the beginning when I was doing this reporting, I was like, oh, maybe the tool did find out that there's, some connection between playing lacrosse in high school and being successful at the job. And there was an older example in the employment lawyer, it was like no, the tool reads keywords on a resume. Like the tool has no like magic capabilities. It looks at like statistical relevant inferences. So maybe there were a bunch of people who played lacrosse in high school that they were successful at the job or had the name Jared or Thomas. So maybe there were a bunch of Thomases in the pile, and the tool had a statistically relevant result. So suddenly those became keywords that were relevant. And, as we all know, is like, I mean, human hiring is flawed. Like humans are not very good at hiring, but hopefully we know that the name Thomas should not be a consideration, right? We should be really hired for our skills and experience in the job, not for our hobbies. Not for our locations, where we have worked, where we come from. It's pretty basic for a lot of humans, but computers do not know that. They just take statistical inferences, and if no one keeps monitoring the system, which we see again and again, that they're often off-the-shelf solutions, and I'm not sure that a lot of vendors closely scrutinize these results, and I don't think a lot of companies closely scrutinize the results. And the resume screeners, another lawyer who said he found problems in about 1/4 of the resume screeners he looked at. He said he found one that gave folks who had the word baseball on their resume more points, and folks who had the word softball on their resume fewer points. And that is really hints at gender discrimination in the US, because more men like and play baseball, and mostly women play softball. So we see this often, that the computer tools just look at statistical inferences and bring in biased variables that maybe look like neutral, but when you take a closer look, it's like, oh, this is actually not neutral at all. And a lot of times it might say, maybe playing lacrosse in high school says more about your socioeconomic background than actually if you're qualified for the job.
Let me double down a little bit. So lawyers is one of the sources. What were the other sources that you look to if somebody's wanting to replicate this kind of experiment? What are the sources to?
We love to talk to ex-employees, folks who have just left companies that we're looking at, or the field. And I sometimes say, maybe the further they've gone outside of the field, the better. So if somebody was in an HR AI company and left to open like a bakery in Vermont, that probably means that, they left the field entirely for whatever reason, we don't know, but they might be much more open to talk than someone who left an HR AI company and went to a competitor. Although, it's always worthy to talk to folks. And I've had actually a couple of folks who left their original company and were quite open to talk. One is Eric Sedell, who left one of the largest one-way video interview companies, was actually bought by HireVue. It's called Modern Hire. Was bought by HireVue, and he left. And he talked about that he thinks there are lots and lots of little Theranoses in the field, and there's a lot of snake oil. And that's really worrisome if the field itself know, the people in the field, that there's huge problems. And actually some other CEOs of vendors told me that there's a lot of snake oil, and they know that there are a lot of unproven methods. And so that was really helpful to ask people too, like, like what keeps you up at night? One CEO told me, well, there's this other company that's doing X. That's really worrisome. And I was like, oh, I'll look into that. Might be nothing, but it actually turned out to be a real thing, and a really problematic tool that inferred personality traits based on social media. So, finding out based on your Twitter, are you dominant? Are you conscientious? I tested that, and we'll get to the testing in a minute, but, and it's not working, but that's one of the things. I also went to a ton of conferences, and I love conferences because so many people just want to chat. And even, I have a badge, I'm a journalist, like they can clearly tell I'm a journalist. And people often still want to talk. Sometimes I get to meet with CEOs because they are at the booth, right? Like maybe they don't answer my PR inquiry when I email them or I LinkedIn message them. I don't get anything back, but they're actually there. And, maybe it's considered rude to walk away from your own booth if a journalist shows up. But I also think, there are a lot of salespeople on the floor, and they're happy to demo you the tool because that's exactly what they're there for. So even though maybe some companies were reluctant to demo demo a tool to me, they were very happy to speak about their technology at these conferences. And a couple times, I talk to people exactly. I'm like, oh, I know this about your company that, one of the things that you can use in the AI tool is like zip codes. We know in the US that could be really biased because we have historical redlining of people not being allowed to get mortgages in certain parts of the town because of racial bias. So we still live a lot of segregated lives. And they were like, oh, no, it's just like, it's very neutral and I trust my developers. And I was like, okay, that's like really important to know. So I love going to these HR tech conference, and some of them were online. So I just listened to the session, found really interesting things. And maybe that's a segue, because in one of the HR tech conferences, I saw a talk by Curious Thing AI. The company rep was talking about the tool, and it's marketed to companies mainly in the West who want to hire call center employees, mainly in the global South. And one criterion, or maybe arguably the most important one, is like, do folks speak English? So this AI tool, Curious Thing AI, was going to find out how well people speak English in a phone interview with an AI capability in the back. So if you get a phone call from Christine, the AI interviewer, and she would ask you some questions, and then the tool would tell the potential employer, how good the prospective applicant speaks English. So it's like, great. So I, heard the demo. He demoed the tool, and I was like, this sounds really interesting. I'm gonna test this out. Sounds pretty cool. So I bought a monthly license. I think it was about $200. And started testing it. And one of the things I did, I set up an interview with like they have like a bank of questions. So, very generic things like, why do you apply for the job? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Have you overcome any obstacles? And, how did you ever overcome a, important obstacle in your job? Very generic questions. So I set this up, did the interview, and I spoke in English and talked about like, oh, this is, what happened in my job, yada, yada, yada. And at the end, I sent it out, got an email back, and I got an 8.5 out of 9 English proficient. So first I was like, wow, this tool works really well. And, clearly maybe I was a little proud. This is sort of like the thing, when you see the number, it's hard to not believe in. So I was like, oh man, this is really cool. English is my second language. Apparently I'm very good speaking English. And then I tried to do some tests. So like I ran silence through it, like I didn't answer anything. And I got you don't get a result. I spoke just like I'm good at teamwork in 50 different ways. And then I did a test that I think was very clarifying and interesting. So when I talked to some of the vendors before, like what happens with people, for example, who have a speech impairment, people who have accents, how well do these tools transcribe? Because, it doesn't infer results based on the audio. It actually transcribes most of the time. It transcribes the words. What if the transcription isn't correct? So what people have told me is like, most vendors told me that candidates have to hit a certain threshold to be scored. I don't know what that means, but if you don't hit that threshold, you would go to a human hiring person. So I was like, all right, let's test it a little bit. So what I did is I did the same questions, and I just read in German the answer, the text on Wikipedia about psychometrics. So I didn't say anything about work. And I sent it out, and I thought I would get, obviously a mistake, right? Like something, no result, and I would be routed to a human hiring manager. But instead, I got a 6 out of 9 English competence score, and I was really surprised because I didn't speak a word of English. So what I also do, because I work in journalism, we always reach out to folks to comment before publications, and often, I've started doing this weeks before now. To just get them in the loop. And here I also talked to the developers. And, what was really kind of striking was like, they sort of explained, oh, this is like in a 5D space. And there's like German next to English, and the tool, got confused. And I was like, what is a 5D space? I was very confused. I was like, I'm really sorry. I don't do higher math.
Yeah.
And, at the end, I was just like pushing for, and I think that's another thing I urge journalists to do, is like be very skeptical. And ask for a clear explanation. Like, I was like, well, what if you're standing in front of a judge and you have to explain, why was I rejected or why was I put into the next round? Can you just clearly and like in layman's terms explain what happened? They couldn't. And I think that speaks to some of the problems in the field where, if you use deep neural networks, you don't need to know what that means, but some subset of machine learning, which is often used, is like, we know the training data going in, we can look at some of the results, but we don't know exactly what the algorithms score on. And I would argue for high stakes decision making, which is hiring, it matters if we get a job. To most of the job applicants, it matters. And we are very nervous, and it matters if we make money and can put a roof over our head and maybe have a job that we fully enjoy. A lot of our identity is connected to that. So it does matter. We really need to think through, is this the appropriate tool to use in these high stakes decision making? If we don't know what the algorithm scores on. Yeah.
I want to pick up on something you were saying there, that the guys are kind of going, the 5D space, no. And you did mention earlier there are a lot of snake oil salesmen in this space. So it is clear alarm bells should be going off when someone's not able to clearly explain to you how something works. But devil's advocate, how can you tell the difference between someone who's just giving you word soup and you actually not having a grasp of the technical knowledge?
Yeah, and I think I've certainly encountered that too. So I think there was like sort of a learning curve that at the beginning I got these like pages of company trying to explain something to me, and I'm like, wow, this is like all higher math. I really don't understand. Sounds very good. But over time I got a little bit more discernible that I was like, okay, if you can't explain what this tool is about, that is a flaw in how you've built the tool. And I'm pretty certain that is a fact that needs to be reported. Does it mean that the tool inherently is flawed? I don't really know, but it really should give us pause. But what I also did is, as I went through this world of hiring and AI in the world of work, I cultivated experts and folks that have been, one was, for example, a former employment lawyer who worked on AI tools in a firm, and he actually did a lot of analysis. So he was like a trusted source, and somebody else who's an industrial organization psychologist, knows a lot about statistics and psychometrics that I don't know much about. So a couple of times when I had, so one of the things that, I urge now HR managers to check is like vendors who build the tool, they should have a technical report where they sort of lay out, okay, what is the academic literature this is based on, but also how was the tool validated? Like, how do we know that it actually checks for, my team working skill and doesn't check for some randomness? So they should be validation studies that they've done. They also should be audits for possible discrimination in the tool, and usually they check for women versus men and in different races. In the United States, there's no intersectionality, which is another problem. But some of the technical reports are very technical. I don't understand them. So some of the sources were really helpful to look at, like, find the validation coefficient. Everything else, like, there is like the one number that will tell you how valid this tool is. And in statistics, it's like 0.3 is some sort of relevance. And even some of the tools were underneath that. I think also, so that was really helpful to find out that, like, there probably isn't a whole lot of statistically relevant stuff here, or maybe it's 20%, but then that means 80% of the job interviews or what the tool analyzes actually not part of the assumption. So it's a very low validity. We never have 100% in hiring. But I think so cultivating those experts and sending that to them, I learned through them over time, to be also maybe a little bit more confident, just be like, what is this? Another tool I tested, similar things. I got a 73% match score when I spoke German. And, same thing. I read the same Wikipedia entry. I got a transcription in this case that was just, it didn't even make sense in English. Some of the words didn't make sense in English. And when I called the company, they said, oh yeah, of course, like the tool understood that, obviously tools don't understand, but the tools understood that you weren't speaking English. So it just matched you on the intonation of my voice. And I was like, the
Wow.
intonation of my voice tells me I'm
In a different language.
successful for the job, predicted to be successful in the job. Come on.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
I think,
so we find information by attending conferences, webinars, looking
ex-employees.
at data, ex-employees, and there was a last one, what was it? Testing, independent testing, and find yourself a kind of expert co-pilot that you can work with to refer. Watch out for the word soup. I've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to audience questions, starting with friend Siska downstairs from Chile. But essentially, what are the other industries we should be looking at around using AI tools, and how can you tell if someone is using AI tools?
So I think, what I would suggest, anywhere where there is high stakes decision making and we use algorithms is a good place to probe. So I think, we've seen, and I don't think we've seen a whole lot of probing in, for example, I would assume that like mortgages or getting a loan is a high stakes decision making. We often use algorithms, and sometimes they're actually like kind of very basic scoring, right? In the US, we have a credit score. So there's actually somewhat of a clear process. And we've seen, like in Germany, they have a Schufa, and actually that isn't really known how the Schufa scores German consumers on their credit worthiness. So like Algorithm Watch did a big sent your data in question. So I think that would be one. Social algorithms, like anything giving you benefits, anything that may take away your benefits, that assumes, like has an algorithm how disabled you are or not. Like a lot of these are built on sort of problematic assumptions. So I think we have a whole lot to do there. I mean, I think any kind of algorithms are probably worthy. I mean, sometimes I do think that like algorithms have a place, and AI has a place to help us sort through our emails and spam. I don't know if anyone wants to investigate that. It's probably a very low stakes environment. But anywhere where I think also the future is predicted is, like, are you going to be committing fraud or something like that? I mean, the future is inherently uncertain for humans. And, this is probably also the reason why human hiring managers, they have unconscious bias, but they also just have never been really good at predicting who's going to be successful, right? We have a lot of people who leave a new job. If humans haven't figured out, why do we think AI has figured this out, that it can predict if you're going to be a successful employee? So I think there's a whole lot to go on. And then there was a second part of your question that I forgot.
What other industries should be covering? Oh, and how do you know if they're using AI in the process? Like, is there something hidden in source code somewhere that suggests AI is being used, or just conversation?
Maybe, but I wouldn't know. Like, I mean, I have very basic Python skills. I really couldn't code any of these tools. I can't do machine learning. Like, I can sort of check if the code may be able to run, just because I've seen it so many times. But I really have no elaborate technical expertise, and everything that I've learned was like on the job reporting on this. And I'm trying to say, like, no one needs that kind of technical reporting. Like, I think, so, I also used a lot of FOIA's, Freedom of Information requests, which I think might be really helpful. It helped me fact check some of the companies who say X, but then in the FOIA emails, you see when a company works with a government vendor, in this case, it was a school district in the United States that uses one-way video interviews to hire teachers. They were contradicting themselves. So it's a very great tool. Anyone can file a FOIA. And there's actually FOIA machines. Those are great to use. I don't think they are AI. They're just...
there you go. So you can use AI to investigate.
But what I'm saying, like, even if I would get an algorithm through a FOIA, I wouldn't know what to do with it. But what I'm trying to say is, like, the results of these tools matter. And those we can potentially test. And some of the tests that I did in the adversarial testing, and I think anyone can use those methods to use in other high stakes environments. We've seen people use synthetic data to maybe check large job platforms. What do they suggest to people? Do they suggest, maybe more pizza delivery jobs to men and more dash to women? And they use synthetic ads for that kind of stuff. So there's like ways to test these algorithms. We just look at the results because we probably would never get to the algorithm. I wouldn't even know what that means. You also need the training data in most of the times to actually to assess an algorithm. We often don't get access to the training data. But I think that keeps me to another thing is like the skepticalness. So for some reason, we as journalists aren't too skeptical, I think, because AI feels so complex and there isn't a whole lot of other folks who can put things into perspective. So I think when a company says, oh, it's like 90% accurate, we just take that. Or I've seen, the head of marketing say, oh, of an AI company will say like, oh, this will revolutionize healthcare. I'm like, what does that guy have to say about healthcare? So I think we often don't go to more critical folks. Like we would never say, oh, Nike says this is the best shoe. We would never print this is the best shoe. But for some reason, we would go to independent people to be like, is this shoe any good? Can you tell me? But it's really hard for AI because it seems so opaque and hard to understand. So I think even being skeptical of the results, like how was this tested? Was this actually tested with real world data, or was this just in the laboratory? So, and I think what helps me sometimes is like thinking, so a random number generator, a coin toss is 50% accuracy. So if somebody has just above 50 or 70%, there's a very low accuracy for these tools. And another skeptical question is like, well, was the AI trained on your own training set? So often companies bring in data and they train it on 80% and 20% is withheld from the computer, and they use that later to check for accuracy. So that's the same data that is used. So yes, it should be a very high accuracy, but that doesn't actually mean that the tool will be accurate in the real world. So sometimes it helps to ask like, okay, did a third party test this? Did some independent scholars test this? This will really help you. Did you use any real world data to just sort of assess, okay, like how valid may these results be?
Okay. So anything where a service is required or a right may be impinged, look there, use FOIAs, and if you can get your hands on the training data, you might find really interesting information there. I'm going to go downstairs to our fellows. Let's start with Francisca from Chile, while I quickly read all of these questions in the Q&A.
Hi, thank you for the interesting answers, fascinating subject. I was wondering, after your research, would you say that it's the problem with our algorithms are more often due to wrong assumptions, mistakes, or they also sometimes reflect the biases of the humans behind the algorithm?
I mean, as an investigative journalist, I'm interested in like sort of systemic problems. I'm not assuming that there's one rogue HR manager who doesn't like women and is going to like weaponize some of these tools to do this, right? Like I assume that like everyone has the right intentions, that companies feel like, and I do understand that a lot of companies, especially larger ones, want to use these tools because they get, a company like Google gets about 3 million applications a year. So they really do feel like we need a technological solution. I just assume we need the right technological solution to judge people. But so I think you're really right in pointing out that our human biases are embedded in the data. So we've seen this maybe somewhat infamously with Amazon had built a resume screener a few years back that was trained on resumes from people who are currently at the company. And so if it was for, tech roles, what we've seen historically, we've seen a lot of bias in tech companies, and there's a gender bias that we see, or more men being hired into the job than women. So what we've seen in the resume screener, so the resume screener was trained with resumes from current people in the job, they had more men than women. And it picked up that if you had the word woman or women on your resume, like, I don't know, women's chess club, you're part of this women's softball team or something, that those resumes were downgraded because the tool had learned over time that folks with the word woman or women on their resume were not successful at Amazon. And that reflects the gender disparities that we had historical in the company. So yes, so I think most of the training data is actually already biased. Like, so some companies use performance reviews to train an algorithm, and we know that people of color and women are underestimated in performance reviews. And even though they have the same performance as other folks, they often get less good performance reviews. So those are biased. So most of the data reflects our human biases, but we wash them through a computer, and we feel now it's objective data. So we see this again and again, that we see these biased variables or historical biases creep up. I would also suggest to test some of the tools with the folks that might be really be harmed by some of these tools. So one of the things, what I did is check a gamified assessment where you play sort of a video game that looks like pre-Pac-Man. It's very basic. But I played it with somebody who has a disability. And what was interesting, like one of the things that you have to do in the tool is like hit the space bar as fast as possible. So he was really concerned that he was like, well, what if I had a motor disability and I couldn't use my hand as fast as others? Like, I would probably be rejected even though I could do the job. And the other questions that came up were like, well, what job is it that you have to hit the space bar very fast, right? Like, what does it have to do with the job? So there are lots of questions in some of these tools.
Hong Chao, do you still feel that your question's been answered? Yes, you do. Okay. And there's a similar, along the same lines from Alana Guy. How do you differentiate between AI bias in the data set versus AI bias in the algorithm design? I think you've also pretty much addressed that one. So thank you, Alan. A question for you from Ian Grant, and I'm not sure how close is the correlation between the winner chosen by the algorithm and success on the actual job?
Oh, I love that question. I have some thoughts on this.
Okay.
So I sort of told a lot of companies that I would love to know this too. And in fact, a lot of companies don't know that either. Like, do the tools actually work long term? And is the person who's been ranked as the most successful in the hiring phase, are they actually going to be the most successful? So I've asked companies now for a long time to please do this longitudinal studies, and maybe even really large companies who hire, like, I don't know, thousands of people, maybe for their retail stores or something, hire people the traditional ways, use AI tools, and keep the labels on the employees without obviously telling someone, hire the people that are actually and know from the AI tool, a yes, and maybe, and like look at them through years to come and lots and lots of large sample size to actually tell, are these people actually that were predicted to be successful in the job? So the problem is we don't have this data. I know that vendors also would like to have this data, but companies often, people change their jobs. They don't have, I'm sure that this would take a lot of time and money and labor to actually set up these trials. But I think we actually would need that to really tell, are these tools actually working?
Okay, a lot of questions here from quite a few people, essentially asking, how do you detect that content has been generated through artificial intelligence? Are there tools for this? I don't know.
So when I was writing the book, I was lucky enough that I could like update the book as I go along before the publication date. And where we've seen generative AI in hiring and at work is more on the candidate side. So I think it has been, I think a lot of job applicants felt a little bit of helplessness because they, sent their application into the ether and they never hear back. And I think with generative AI, some job applicants now feel like, oh, I can, use ChatGPT to generate a cover letter, help me polish my resume, train for a job interview, right? I can ask the tool, like, what are the most commonly asked questions? Maybe what are the most commonly, the best answers for certain questions in hiring. So I cannot tell you how to spot if a document was generated with AI. I think what I usually do is I run all of the results that I generate through the companies and want to have a check. Because I do sometimes, I did an investigation on gender bias in AI visual tools for social media for The Guardian, and we ran thousands of photos through classifiers. And we just wanted to make sure, like, was there something wrong in our methodologies? So we shared it with all the tech companies. They didn't dispute any of the findings. So I think that was really helpful. And we did that weeks before, right? Not 2 days before. So I think I would run, if you feel like, okay, this document says it was generated by IBM or something is a leak of IBM, I would run this by IBM, and I would assume that the company has an interest to also help you and help themselves if this is generated or not. But we have a whole new world, especially as journalists in front of us, right? I also worry about, so some of the testing that I did with the tools, one was, for example, I wasn't in front of the video interview. It was supposed to check the intonation of my voice, and I deep faked my answer. So I just typed them and my deep fake Descript voice answered, and I still got, very high rating for the job, even though there's no one in front of the camera and I deep faked my voice. So if the AI tools don't have basic tools like proctoring software where, at least somebody has to move a little bit built in.
Yeah. Whereas
Caution. So that actually has led, the FBI in the US put out a warning to employers saying, hey, you really want to check these tools because we've seen a lot of candidate swapping. And so we have a whole lot of new world as journalists, like, is the person that we're talking to actually the person that they say they are? If we do text-based interviews, like, how are they generated? Like, there's a whole slew of new verification that we will have to do.
Yeah, we've got about 9 minutes left, and I'm very sorry to everyone online, but Ingeborg from Norway has given us the perfect way to finish off this seminar, because essentially what she is about to describe to you is the perfect case for some really great AI investigative work. Inge works for the biggest labor press magazine in Norway. Inge, go ahead and read your question. And then, Hilke, if you wouldn't mind telling me, if it were you, how would you approach investigating this story?
Yeah, Norway is publishing their own Nord GPT today, actually, a test version. And they say that it's going to take privacy and data security in account, and all the data are supposed to be kept in Norway. And the goal is to use it for doctor appointments and medical diagnosis, and also to preserve our language. And it's preserve our languages and a democratic, sustainable society. Do you think this is a good tool to meet discrimination and unconscious bias?
So I think what strikes me as really interesting, and I think I'm pushing into that area now too with some of the reporting. Like, I think actually healthcare is a really high stakes environment, right? If we use algorithms in there, because people could literally die if a tool gives the wrong information to a doctor. So I think there's a whole lot of there to sort of think through what is happening. I think we also know that some healthcare virtual appointments, the audio is being transcribed and is the transcript, instead of lieu of notes taking. So is this accurate? There's a lot of questions there. And I think the interesting thing about healthcare is sometimes you can actually figure out, did a patient develop this problem, yes or no? So was the prediction right? So we've seen Epic is a large company in the United States that does a lot of the medical health records. So they actually have a lot of access to medical records. They wrote a sepsis prediction AI tool a few years back that was going to predict, okay, here are the patients that come into the hospital, here are all their symptoms, and it was going to predict, are you going to develop sepsis or not? And meaning that doctors should, take more care of you because sepsis can be deadly. So it was interesting. There was a group of University of Michigan researchers who actually then asked a couple of years later, well, did the patient develop sepsis, and was the prediction right? And so they found out that the tool wasn't as accurate as the company said, and a lot of hospitals now have abandoned the tool. So I think in healthcare, like, is there a way to test these tools to double check, like, did the patient actually develop these symptoms that the generative AI predicted to a doctor, right? Like, those are kind of ways where I would easily see, like, okay, we can actually quote unquote fact check or verify the predictions. So I would look into that. Is that possible somehow?
What would your RTI request, your FOIA requests, would they be?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want anything, any communications between the tool and the doctors to understand, okay, what are the inquiries, like what do doctors put in there, and also, or nurses, and what are the outputs, and I think you could fact check that too, right? Like, is this like the best way to assess the tool? And we've seen some misfires in healthcare, and that does really worry me, because we've seen a misfire in radiology photos where AI tools were trained on thousands of images of breast cancer or something like that, and it turns out what they actually predicted upon is the name of the hospital or the ruler that was in the side of the images. So I think we've seen, when I reported on vocal biomarkers, which is sort of, moving into the healthcare space. So I think a lot of works monitoring will move into this healthcare space where you can take my speech stream and say, like, oh, she's depressed or anxious today. And we see that moving into universities and other places. And I think what's kind of interesting is, like, some of the academics I spoke with, they fact check the tools by taking out the voices, because the tool is supposed to fact check on the voices and predict based on my voice. But what if it does the background? So apparently with COVID coughs, everyone tried to find an AI tool that's going to predict if my cough is COVID or not. So what can happen is like they found out when they looked at the background sounds, took out the coughing sounds, that the tool predicted on the background sounds, because a lot of COVID patients were in a hospital with beeps and, it sounded very sterile. And a lot of people who didn't have COVID were just coughing on the street. So the tool didn't actually learn what was a COVID cough. It learned on the background sounds because they were so different. So there's actually ways, and if you work with a computer scientist, they can probably help you, and I can help you. Like, I work a lot with, I sort of have a half academic role. I'm a journalism professor at a research university, so I get to meet a lot of colleagues who are computer scientists and sociologists, and I often work with them to make these, like, sort of larger samples, right? Like, I test myself, 5 other people as a journalist, and I can say, like, oh, I think there's a problem here. But when I worked with, replicated some of these experiments with maybe more like a much larger sample size, I can more authoritatively say, okay, I tested this according to scientific protocols, and there really isn't anything here. The tool is brittle and doesn't work. So I would suggest that too, if you want to do some large healthcare investigations. And think about, like, you can FOIA audio, you can FOIA videos, right? Some of the answers from a generative AI tool, like, all those will be locked somehow. And if the country has a robust freedom of information law, those things are FOIAble. It's not just documents or emails, right? Like, you technically can ask for an algorithm, but you also have to ask for the training data. And that usually gets complicated because in hiring, there's personal data included, and they would redact that. So I don't know if you can easily replicate something, but we can test the results of
Mm.
algorithms. So
Brilliant.
I think that's where, and that's to me is also what matters. It doesn't really matter to me what algorithm you use. It's the results of those discriminatory, of those not working. That's important to me.
Brilliant. So when Ingeborg goes home, she can put in lots of FOIAs, find an expert co-pilots, look for people who've resigned from the company hired to build the thing, and do some of her own testing to see what results she's getting.
Yeah, and work with academics because they often get access to proprietary data to check this. So I think that could be helpful to be sort of like a journalism co-pilot with them to sort of understand, okay, what are they finding out, and can I report on that, and can I help them? I actually feel like there's something really fruitful that we as journalists often sort of are a little bit closer, maybe have our ears to the ground to understand, okay, this is happening, and we can work with researchers to do the research, because a lot of researchers don't actually know what is happening inside companies, inside healthcare, like the quick changes. And we can help them have good questions to ask to get the right data. And we learn from that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hilke, for all of your time today. This is the best Christmas wish come true. And it was so great.
Oh, it was amazing. Thank you all for like engaging and please, there's only one Hilke Schellmann. So you'll find me on LinkedIn, on my website. Feel free to email me. It might take me a day or so to get back to you, but I'm super interested, and steal my methods, I think, and invent new ones. Like we need to as investigative journalist, I want to hold the powerful accountable. And I do think that some of the power has now moved to AI tools. So we need to hold those accountable. And we need to find, use our old methods, but also find new ones to hold these tools accountable. So I think it's like a shared endeavor that we as journalists do together to build out this new field.
Amen to that. And is there like a society for journalistic AI investigators?
There isn't yet, but we
have
a lot of collaborations, and maybe, I do think sometimes, while I was writing the book, I was thinking like, who should regulate this, and I did think that like, maybe there needs to be some public interest technologists that work with journalists to test these tools and maybe build some tools too. Like, can we build a resume screener that actually isn't biased? That would be great. And can we put that into the public knowledge, put it on GitHub or something, our code, and document how it works, and put pressure on companies to buy the right technology. So I do think that there might be some crossover of journalism and academic research to push to make the world a better place, because the startups that I've reported on have a real push to bring their product to market, and they need to make money back for their investors. And there isn't a whole lot of time to do this like more scientific inquiry, like do this actually work? Are these methods sound? So I think if we can take that away, maybe we can build better tools and audit some of these tools. And I think that's basic journalism work, but maybe at a grand scale that not one journalist can do, but we can partner with other institutions and other researchers.
Brilliant. I hope you're all inspired. I am. Thank you, Hilke.
So I'm building this coalition, but I'm always open to bring other people in the fold. Like I think we all have to build this together and learn from each other.
Agreed, 100%. You've got my backing.
Thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and
thank you, Hilke,
being with us.
Thank you. Go well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Give that toddler some more snacks.
Yes, I will.